Everyone, just doing a quick sound check. If you want to just manage, if you could just enter in the chat box if you guys can hear us, if you're joining us now. Waiting for a cue.
Check good.
All right.
Sounds good.
Cool. So we're just waiting for last few people to join on, and then we'll kick things off probably at 10:31, 10:32 PST. You like play charades while you wait?
Yeah. Sounds like.
Exactly.
Automation. That'd be a tough one, actually.
Just let me know. You see things start slowing down. I'm coming in. All right. Also, we're probably gonna kick off in a minute. You should see a questions section. Feel free to submit your questions there. You can put them in the chat box, but probably get picked up faster if you're in the questions box. And looks good. All right, cool. So everyone, welcome to Bridging the Gap Between Manual Testing and Automation. Pretty awesome. We have people coming from Switzerland, Mexico, Taiwan, India, I think New Zealand joining us today. So thank you very much. This is our biggest webinar yet. Also, like I said earlier, feel free to submit your questions and we will get to them, if not during the conversation, then at the end. We're going to set aside about 20 minutes. So my name is Mike Dobos. I'm coming from Testlio. We have Jared with us.
Yep, also from Testlio, team lead here, project manager as well.
And of course, the man of the hour special guest, Ken Tolley.
Hi, I'm Director of QA at Lumosity.
All right, so I guess we'll kick things off. Ken, you've been with Lumosity, Lumis Labs for about 6 months?
Yeah, about 6 months, yeah.
Okay, and what has changed since you came on board?
So quite a few things. The company's moving pretty quickly. When I came in, it had a solid manual QA team functioning pretty well. One of the first things I did was actually get the QA team to start looking at new tools for automation, particularly things that might be AI focused, give them a sense that the world is a little bit bigger than they're used to, and there might be something that they can actually access. Not too long after that, I started to look through the career ladder for QA and made some changes to that. A lot of times in companies, they'll have a progression that usually leads to more technical and coding skills as a way to move up, but that's not exactly representative of all the range of QA. So I provided some explanations for more technical roles that people can do, as well as roles that were not coding focused, but technical in their own way, more product centric, and set up a career ladder that goes along in those two paths, as opposed to one that required an educational lead that they could necessarily make.
Very cool.
The last thing I did, I started trying to pitch behavior-driven development to the engineering team. So we are making some inroads towards a pilot to get that going. If you want to talk about that some more later, we can describe what that is and why I think that's actually going to be helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm curious, what was the, you said that you've been pitching. What's been the biggest challenge in introducing behavior-driven development to the team?
Part of the problem with that is either engineering teams are unfamiliar with it or they have a misconception of exactly what that is and what it's for. It's usually thought of as something called test-driven development, where you're writing your tests first and you're using that. And just generally speaking, depending on the culture of the engineering team and the platforms they're focused on, their misconceptions can be quite different. Test-driven development is very much about code design as opposed to testing something. It's helping you architect your code. It has a side effect of letting you know you've done something wrong. And behavior-driven development in a similar fashion is less about testing and being code-centric, and it's more about really maximizing communication and collaboration with diverse groups. Right? That's its focus. That's its methodology. Again, later down the track, the side effect is you get some effective automation that can help you out.
Okay.
Sure. But really making sure the go right cases are there, the desired behavior is accurate, interpreted, and still be.
Yeah, you can do tons of test automation if you have the resources, but you can still be building the wrong thing, and you can
Exactly. Yep.
So.
So you talked about kind of the challenges of communicating with the engineering team. What about on the product side?
So there's sort of a central premise that you get your user stories if you're doing Scrum. Sometimes they're really well done. Sometimes they're vague, depending on the way the teams function in a given organization. Sometimes they're kind of rushed and they're not complete. But that's what the developer has to start working with when they start writing their code, which means at a minimum there's a and churn back and forth with the product owner, try to figure out exactly what to do. Or in some organizations, that product owner or that marketing person or that whoever isn't entirely available. So the developer is making their best guess on what to build. And when they get it wrong, that's technical debt.
Yep.
That's confusion. That's hard to test. That's errors and defects.
Yeah. Extra cycles, time.
Extra cycles. It just sort of cascades into basically everybody the engineer has to work with to actually get the product out is all affected by the fact that they just didn't know exactly what it is they were supposed to build, which again isn't necessarily the product owner's fault. Sometimes you're not entirely sure of all the cases they need to work from, and they're dependent on QA to tell them that.
Mm-hmm.
And if they're at the end of the cycle, then it's kind of late by the time they get that feedback. So
yeah, so you actually bring up a good point there of getting QA involved in that process, and they're really a critical part in it. Right?
Yeah.
So
And the earlier the better.
from my point of view, there's value at the ideation phase before you write the user story to sort of, this is the concept of what I think the user wants. This is the value I think we can deliver. QA, unlike developers and product owners, are using the product all the time.
Mm-hmm.
They're looking at user forms, they're getting feedback, they're working with customer service on tickets that are coming in. They have a sense of what the behavior of the user might be and what they might want. They can provide good feedback in that regard. In the same way a developer can say, well, we can make these changes to our architecture or our code that better fulfills this desire that you have.
Sure.
So at that phase, they're certainly valuable. By the time you get to that user story where you start actually writing the spec, they're extremely valuable in that case because they have a sense of what's likely to go wrong as the user tries to do something.
Exactly. Yeah. The real product experts.
Yes.
A lot of times.
Yeah.
And then with regards to behavior-driven development, how do you handle retrofitting like the tests to like, let's say, like legacy code bases when you're transitioning to like a BDD workflow?
Sure. I'd actually say, or at least I'd say I'm experimenting with the notion of just starting with the concept, see if we can get better specifications, build better products from that initial communication and collaboration. Anything new that we do coming in that direction, ideally we'll get some automated tests, and that will do feature validation for us. And if that's something we get that's valuable, as you start looking backwards, typically companies that have to refactor areas of the code, they may have to make changes or updates to fit new feature requirements. I don't think it's necessarily important to go back and just cover everything that you have. It's better to just kind of go forward and then fill in the gaps when you have an opportunity to go back into that code base.
We can circle back around and
It's not a targeted effort. It's, hey, I happen to be here, so maybe we need something around here for testing. But also you can look at other end-to-end testing tools to get that broader coverage to help you out when you know that you're sort of breaking things.
Cool. In your experience, I guess, for this, do you have a plan of going back and at least hitting some like critical areas as well, or are you purely just doing a moving forward approach?
So that's kind of to be determined.
Okay, sure.
So there's a lot of things that actually, like I said, I came into Velocity and they had a high level of quality, particularly for being as manual as they were. And so a lot of areas of the product are stable. New things are probably at most risk when they're going out. Big projects are at most risk when they're going out. And the areas that require additional coverage, if there are problems, we can certainly cover those in a variety of different ways. And it's just a matter of figuring out what's going to be the most efficient and most effective.
Sure.
I think the areas that have the most challenge right now are related to localization. That seems to be much more of a moving target with text that changes.
Yeah, sure.
And so I would say the one actually true automation effort they have there was put in by the development team, was just doing some screenshotting and trying to check for where those problems actually happen so that they can catch them as they go. Very cool. And again, because that was a hypercritical area, they voluntarily went and did that, even though it had overhead associated with it.
Sure. For the screenshotting, are you talking about like appearance testing for this through automation, or just as a reference? Kind of?
So it's definitely appearance. So you have text field. It happens to be in German. It runs over. It's incomplete.
Yeah.
They've put in some mechanisms to help detect the end of the string, for example, so they know that the full string is actually there, and they can actually do that usually with a simple diffing tool.
Yeah.
But there's still overhead associated with it, and there's it's automation, so things break and require maintenance.
Yeah, but that can be a really important tool to a lot of organizations, is having that appearance testing in place, and it's one that I've seen be overlooked pretty often as well as an option.
Yeah, because it's difficult.
Exactly.
Makes sense. So do you have any questions about behavior-driven development that we're taking? And
that was a very high level.
Speak into the mic.
Oh,
yeah.
That was a very high level description, so you should definitely read about it if you get a chance.
Yeah, absolutely. So just kind of the next section that we would talk about is, at Testlio, a lot of times when dealing with partners of ours, we are trying to identify whether they are in fact ready to start embracing automation practices. So what are some of kind of the checks and balances that you look for when evaluating whether you're truly ready to start automating?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, actually, I think probably, in my experience, I think what's most significant is sort of the attitude about it, the organization. Why do they want to do test automation? What are their objectives? Do they have a functional and working quality process in place already? Sometimes there's a notion that, well, if we just get test automation, it will solve all of our quality issues and our problems. Meanwhile, the problems are much further up the chain.
Sure.
The manual testers are having trouble doing their work, whether or not they have time. Sometimes there aren't structures in place for process. It just really kind of depends. I think when you have an existing manual process, it's working, but it doesn't sort of keep up with the velocity of the team when they want to produce. That's a good point where you want to start looking at what can we do as far as test automation. So then again, you go into a company, sometimes they decide that's what they want to do up front before the rest of these issues are taken care of.
Yep.
And so you basically say, okay, well, what can we do quickly? What's the approach going to be? Is it going to be a lot of training for the existing team? Do we need to hire people in?
Mm-hmm.
You can kind of start at any point in time, but your degree of success and difficulty will be dramatically affected by the health of the rest of the organization as far as quality is concerned, and as far as cooperation and collaboration between departments.
So when evaluating your existing manual practices and determining if just the issue is scalability, what are some of the things that you think might get overlooked that you should be maybe considering when evaluating that? So like how I guess what's the best way to evaluate your manual testing, make sure that yes, it's a scalability thing, it's not like a quality or results issue?
Sure. So if you're not having problems actually, hitting a release target when you're given enough time, things are probably fairly healthy. If there's a good culture between the engineering team, the product team with quality, products making decisions, QAs in the loop early on. Developers look for feedback early on in their feature branches as opposed to after things are integrated. I think if the team is able to actually be pulled into discussions as the organization is making changes, that's generally a healthier environment. Sometimes in environments, there's not always a respect between product dev and QA. That's probably not a good place to kick off something new.
Yeah.
Again, also look at the sort of C-level management, right? So does the CTO support the objective of what's going on? Does the CEO, if the company is small enough, do they support the objective of what's going on? Is there a budget for training if that's the route that they're taking?
Mm-hmm.
How much are they willing to kind of all move together towards an objective? Or is the objective really just coming out of the quality department?
Yeah.
So sometimes you go into an environment and there's a strong push from, say, engineering or a small faction of engineering and not from the rest of the organization. And then, those people change positions and then that support network is gone. Right?
Yeah.
And how do you deal with the constantly changing UI functionality?
Yeah, it kind of goes back to appearance testing, which can be pretty fragile as well. But just in general, I guess how to, some best practices or how maybe in your experience you've dealt with testing and creating those robust tests that are kind of resilient to changes and don't require constant updating.
So if you're doing end-to-end testing where you're focused on the UI, which is useful,
mm-hmm.
You in my opinion, you want to actually try to do as high-level, happy path type of items as you can. Sort of the nitty-gritty bits and pieces and edge cases of your feature testing, you want to do that at a lower level. You want to do it in a tool that's not through the UI.
Yeah.
We'll talk about how that happens sort of separate from this. But your end-to-end tests are going to be slower. They're going to be more expensive to write. They're going to be harder to maintain. So the less of them you have that sort of takes you through your happy path, the better off you'll be. There are tools that are trying to make that more useful. They're a little bit more driven by machine learning and artificial intelligence. The notion there is that the hard part of doing end-to-end testing is somewhere between writing the tests and having to have the coding skill to do so. And then, of course, maintaining the tests because there's so much change in the UI. So some of the systems that are pretty early on are good about self-healing and recognizing that the changes that are being made are not fundamentally functionally different for the user. And so it can kind of take care of that for you. And I think we'll see a lot more of those. I mean, they're already on the market, but I think you'll see a lot more of those come up, and I think they'll be maturing really quickly.
Cool. Do you have any off the top of your head that you have either looked at, experimented with, or just
so so this is our early beta for Test AI that I've been experimenting with and playing with. My last company, we were looking at Functionize, particularly for web testing. And just generally been exploring what's on the market and seeing how things are progressing.
Yeah, sure. As you mentioned, the solutions are still pretty new too and constantly evolving. But yeah, I think there'll be great solutions moving forward as well.
Yeah, I would expect to see that problem decrease. But then again, as I said, when you go with the team, like what's the value? Why are you doing the automated testing? One thing to consider is the biggest value of test automation is actually a tight feedback loop for the engineering team, right?
Yeah.
From their point of view, from a developer's point of view, if they can write a piece of code and know whether or not it's going to have a negative impact on the system, like right there in context, that's valuable. So these systems, these end-to-end tests, are running further down the line, further in the chain. So you have to be strategic about their application.
Okay.
Yes. And actually, just to get some clarification, or at least what you've done in your experience, for those kind of machine learning ones or any that you've experimented with, when are you typically running those in the process? Like, are you doing them every push to master or on a daily basis, or so at least so far? I know they're kind of in the experimentation phase.
Yeah, so that will kind of depend. Okay. My personal impression right now is that because of the different systems and sort of costs associated with the performance, I probably want to do them with sort of every check into master. You get a good comprehensive check to see if there's been an impact. I wouldn't necessarily do it with every feature branch.
Sure.
Something that's at that level should ideally be running with a unit testing system and giving you, I think, not all the way through the UI, but essentially an integration level test or a component level test that lets you know that, hey, I've implemented the spec correctly. These touch points where it has to interact are probably working.
Yeah.
That's a good place to do those. Those are fast, developers and feedback early. The things that are actually harder, the UI pieces, that's actually, from my point of view, it's a little bit more low-hanging as well. If you have a visual artifact that's going to annoy the user, that's not as much of a problem to fix for the developer as, hey, I built this feature entirely wrong. It's not what it's supposed to be doing. It does not bring the value you need. Yeah, that's more expensive. So.
Yeah, and you actually touched on a really good point there too, being able to split out when certain suites are running, and whether it's, when the dev is actually working on it and every commit they're doing it, there's a running suite on their machine. You don't necessarily need to do that for your entire suite, and that's not feasible for all of them. If you're doing that and waiting an hour or whatever for your whole CI suite to run on every commit, obviously
they will stop running the test.
Exactly.
Run the test, and they will stop running the test.
Yeah. So just something to keep in mind, I guess, for people that are really new to it and trying to figure out this whole process.
Yeah, actually, I think that's the key that's missing from collaboration with all the times you're starting an automation project, you're trying to revamp QA. That really needs to be a collective discussion for how do we approach and do this with the development and product and QA together. Then you get a solution that works for everybody.
Yeah.
I think the problem is often if QA is sort of left on the side. This is your responsibility to figure this out. You're responsible for quality.
Yeah. Whereas definitely like involving it in the flow and it really being a part of the process, not a handoff, is really important. Looks like we have another question coming in. Yeah. So one of them is, do you include negative testing in your automation?
You should. I've always tried to put that in as a process plan. With all the teams that have been doing automation, it's usually been very, very difficult for them to have enough time to get to those. I think in an ideal world, and I always kind of had it in plan, you would get your feature coverage at one tier, you'd get some of your area coverage at another, and as issues are found by QA, they put in a test themselves that tells you whether or not this bug is being repeated or coming back in.
Sure.
But yeah, it's hard to have the resources to do that.
Definitely. Yeah.
Yeah.
And we briefly touched on it, but how, you bring that one back. I was going to say, how do you include automation in your agile practice as well? So we talked about when to run it and that sort of thing, but just maybe some more clarification on that.
Yeah, so I certainly had the experience where the QA team is kind of on the outside and they're just building automated tests to essentially cover regression. There's a degree of success you get with that, but again, issues are found fairly late. I've had the experience where QA is working closer to development. Probably the best situation is in a more BDD fashion, where because of that collaboration, there's just a lot less issues that are coming down to QA by the time they're doing their revision pass. At my last company, they got to the point where we actually stopped writing test plans. Everything was covered enough in the test between developers and QA that they didn't actually need to have a manual test plan. They just did ad hoc testing and kept providing new tests.
I've had that experience as well. It's really, it's fun for the QA too. If you don't have to worry about all these little details being hit, you can approach it from a break it attitude.
Yeah, that said, you're looking at big cultural change for the development team to write their own tests, and you're looking at a big educational curve for the QA, particularly the ones that have been doing manual most of their careers to get the technical skills to do that, and also hiring in someone more technical to be the foundation of the framework.
Yeah,
and everybody else writing tests on the top end. So
yeah, that is a great point too. In that, you know, somebody who's really good on the manual side may not be good on the exploratory side necessarily, but there's a certain mindset that kind of goes with each one as well. And somebody with both those skills obviously is ideal.
Yeah,
I think it can happen a lot of times.
I met a QA who said they didn't like doing the exploratory testing. Didn't feel they were good at it so far. So
it happens. Yeah.
I think this is a good question. It's a bit long, so I'm going to obviously read off the screen. Just bear with me. One of the challenges of bridging the gap between manual and automated, I like that they fit the title in there.
Yeah.
One of the challenges between bridging manual and automated testing is showing the return on investment for introducing automation in a project. What kind of metrics could be provided by test automation to show good return on investment?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question. So you can show code coverage, you can show feature coverage, you can show a number of defects that make it out. A lot of metrics you can bring to bear, although in my experience, they don't necessarily matter, right? Because if it's slowing the team down and they're not, the velocity is affected by that, the metrics are not as significant, typically not as significant. If there is expense, right, it requires too much resources to do it, those quality metrics aren't really particularly effective from my experience. I think a lot of companies are looking more at, well, let's hire more developers, let's ship faster. If a problem gets found, recovering is an easier investment to make than it is to actually preventing it. And so I've actually tried not to justify that anymore, right? Because it's just too difficult.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's a little bit like religion. Somebody comes in, they just don't believe it. It doesn't really matter what the data says because they can compensate for it in some other way, right? So rather than sort of look at that and let's get return on investment in automation, it's much more of a let's improve the product, right? Let's collaborate on how we improve the product. Let's figure out how we use automation to help the team increase their velocity. Right? That's what the engineering team cares about.
And scalability. Yeah. I would say scalability as well, because if you're having to manually test everything and all of a sudden you're continuously growing your code base, that is manageable at first, especially as a young startup. Like once you get several years down the line or whatever,
sometimes not even several years. Like if you're doing manual testing, every feature that comes in, if you're doing a really good job, you're not taking any risks. Every feature that comes in is an increase in the scope of work that QA has to do. The QA resources are not increasing along with that scope.
And your risk is
there's a diminishing return there relatively quickly if your team is productive and actually like doing well with Agile.
And as your scope is increasing, your risk is also increasing as well, because the chance of missing something is continuously getting higher.
Your chance of missing something goes up, but more than that, you have to make trade-offs if you're going to actually get the product out in a reasonable period of time. A lot of folks are really focusing on speed, right? So Agile, Scrum, it's synonymous with performance and high velocity.
Yeah.
I personally think that we kind of sacrifice quality for that. I don't think it's intentional. I think it's just an assumption that quality would be there and go faster. It's not a good assumption, but there's really nothing else to tell someone making that decision that that's probably not going to be the case.
Yeah.
What's sort of less talked about is the fact that if you have really good engineering practices and really good quality best practices, that the side effect is you get a faster velocity if you make sure you streamline every aspect of your process, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's a blog that I like from a company. I'm going to mispronounce her name. It's like I just love. I forget the name of it.
We'll send it to you.
Yeah, send it to you. I don't pronounce it
your
well.
way.
But it has a series of things that really focus on the concept of drag, like what causes drag on your team.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes that drag is because you don't have a good CI system and it's slow, so you don't run it, you don't use it.
Yep.
You don't have a good deployment system, so deploying is slow, so your recovery is slow. You don't have a good testing system, so you're not testing what it is you're doing. You don't have a good process. You don't collaborate with QA in the right way
Mm-hmm.
for you to write tests that are efficient with the people who can best write those tests and get the results in a reasonable period of time. Right? Because you don't do that, like you have all these things with drag, and a lot of effort is put into going faster. And you see your burn down chart and your Scrum board, and you're thinking, okay, I have to make these changes and trade-offs. But if your process is corrupt at the beginning, the metrics you're getting aren't necessarily telling you what you need to do to fix it.
Yep.
And that effort that goes in just doesn't really pay off. Right? It's think of a race car.
Yeah.
Right? They put the fins on, they streamline it so that you can go faster. Right? Like getting rid of that drag allows every ounce of power you go in to improve it. But if you have
Parachute behind you or something.
Behind you or a big wall in front of you,
Yep.
Putting in more power just has a diminishing return. So, and it's the same thing, I think, with software and development.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so it sounds like we've talked quite a bit extensively about the different bugs in the processes that you might notice. Now, I'm curious, what are some mistakes that you feel QA management might make when communicating with other departments? Are there any pitfalls that you want to avoid? Because we've talked about kind of the nuances of dealing with engineering your product, but I'd be interested to kind of dig a little bit deeper.
Yeah, I think it's easy to make a lot of mistakes. I'll be the first to admit I make lots of mistakes. I try to learn from my mistakes.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Try to make them faster and recover quicker. But I think a big aspect is just not really making sure that it's clear that like the team is a team and the team works together as a team. I think I've been to places where QA is not embedded with the engineering department. That's a fatal flaw. I have to actually be with them. Most people are pretty good about doing that now, but on the same token, like they have to be perceived as team members. They have to be respected as contributing to what's going on. And if what they're doing is not contributing, then that fundamentally needs to change that and needs to be an agreement from the rest of the organization. We go faster, we put QA at the end of the process, and their job is to test and verify things are that way. But from the engineer's perspective, well, you're telling me something's wrong with my code. Maybe I don't like that.
Mm-hmm.
You're complaining, you want more time, but I have to get my stuff done. Don't complain to me about when I deliver my feature. I delivered it in time. The sprint's not over.
Yeah.
Right. All these sort of conflicts that you run into, where QA is kind of squeezed at the other end, and that's just because they've reduced the scope of what it is that they do to just checking at the end, and that's not really quality assurance, right?
Sure.
Like quality, does everybody agree what quality is? Sometimes you have management that have a completely different perception.
Mm-hmm.
People in quality, and our tendency is to talk about metrics and test plans and process, and we talk a lot about how the sausage is made, and people's eyes glaze over because they don't care.
Exactly. They just focus on the end
How do I
product.
get my product? How do I get it faster? And how do I make my users like it? And if you're not focusing on literally those things, who everybody who's in a position to consume cares about, then you're just kind of wasting your time. You're never going to convince them it has value because they're not quality. Right?
Yeah.
Talk to a product manager about how much they like a regression pass.
They don't. Exactly. Yeah.
They may complain.
Yeah.
They don't like that it takes so long.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But that can circle back too for the QA really being an expert on the product as well, and that's where it plays that role, because they can really focus on what that end user experience should be, and even users who aren't necessarily using it as intended, and focusing on all those aspects and really sharing that with the team.
Right.
Because obviously,
value.
yeah, exactly. Because product is going to have their own view, the devs are going to have theirs, and QA can really tie everyone together.
Yeah, and actually, and to be fair, I wouldn't leave design out of it either. They have
Sure.
an opinion, they have a perspective.
Yep.
Again, depending on where they are in that process, if everybody's at the table and everybody's collaborating on the same objectives, you can figure out a way to get there. But there's that notion that everybody's actually in that same boat together. Not addressing that problem first and foremost as a quality manager is probably the biggest mistake that you can make, because it will inevitably, no matter how successful any of the projects you are, you're never going to deliver the value that sort of comes across as important unless you happen to have a single management that understands quality and appreciates that.
That's great.
So some companies have quality in their DNA. They do it on day one, even though they're startups. And everybody gets to it at some point. And by the time they get to it, it's a necessity. It's not something they want to do.
And there's a lot of hurdles with that initial implementation. That's where it gets really tough to have those conversations, as you're kind of bringing up, and how to get people involved. And
yeah, I mean, this argument, the statements are pretty familiar, like, oh, we don't have time to hire quality in. Well, why is that? Well, we don't know if the product's going to work. We don't know if users are going to like it. We have to make sure we get funding. So we're not going to invest any resources in quality. We're just going to get the product out. Right? Yeah, that seems like it makes a lot of sense, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
All it does
if you're not in quality.
Exactly. Yeah. We have another question from the audience. This is a good segue. How did you first introduce the fully manual testers to automation? Is there an easy first automation script you have them write / software you have them use?
So I've done that in different ways. It kind of depends on how much anxiety they have when I talk to them.
Mm-hmm.
So when I picked up a new quality team, I talked to everybody and kind of get a sense of what it is. For the people that were purely manual, had never done any coding, I brought in built up a framework, has a very highly fluent interface, get a nice IDE so they can look at it, they can say, oh, okay, I'm gonna start writing something, oh, it's filling the code out for me, I feel so much better, right?
Yeah.
And that gets them interested, they will take some classes, they'll learn to code. Use a resource that sort of orients people in coding around games and physical objects that kind of make sense to them, and so it sort of helps them get across that barrier of I can't write code, I won't write code.
Mm-hmm.
That's a factor. My current company, again, I said, well, some of you guys, if you want to go in technical direction, by all means, go to Driver.io, look at Chunk.js, look at these tools, look at Eggplant, see which ones feel the best for you. So, well, what if I can't do something? Well, you got to remember these vendors are all trying to bring something to you, so if it doesn't work for you, it's not your fault, it's their fault.
Yeah.
Figure out the one that gets you closest to it as you want and play with it, experiment. We may or may not pick that for the tool set that we use, but you will get an opportunity to learn. Right?
Yeah, and you're also really empowering them to help be a part of that decision and make that, so that way they're even more comfortable and motivated to really jump in head first. And that's great.
It's sort of coming in with a, hey, learn to code within 3 months or you're fired is not necessarily the best choice.
Yeah, exactly.
That's going to hurt you in a lot of ways.
Yep.
Not to mention the morale.
It's not healthy.
Pretty bad.
Yeah.
But yeah, there's I think when people kind of realize that there are options, they can stick their toe in, they can kind of make their way. It's a good way to do that. Also, if the pseudo management and support, you bring in trainers. So they're all together, they're all collaborating. Those that are more technical are sitting next to the people that are less technical, and they're helping them out. Right? When I try to hire people who are automation experts, I always look for somebody who is open, humble, willing to train, willing to work with others.
Yeah.
They're going to build you a framework that better fits what the QA is comfortable using than someone who just says, well, if you don't understand this, that's not your problem. The two do exist.
They do. Right?
Flexibility and attitude.
Yeah, one thing a person I work for told me that was actually pretty cool is, you have coders and you have engineers. I think it works for people who do automation as well. The coder wants to write code. They like their language, they like their tool set, they like what they're doing. The engineer wants to solve problems. He doesn't care about how, right? It's the problem he wants to solve. And in the case of quality, that problem could be the fact that you have this manual team that is going to have trouble approaching testing. So do you build this up and you have time to build up their skill set? Do you put in a better framework that's easier for them to use? Do you abandon the notion of a framework altogether for some of those folks and you figure out a way for them to integrate the process better? So, and every company is going to have slightly different culture and environment. So
yeah, exactly. Touched on a lot of really good points there. So earlier we've also talked about the devs kind of handling the implementation of automation and writing those as well. But so even if let's say the QA and QA engineers are not writing the automated tests or everything, do you find that it's been really beneficial for them to at least understand? So from that perspective too, it's also good to let them dive in and maybe bring in those training tools so that they understand the test framework. And then, especially if you're implementing it, maybe have them be involved with the devs or pairing with them or whatever to make sure those tests get put in place. Or,
yeah, I would actually say things can be a bit organic, right? So if you have an engineering team that's perfectly happy to write tests, sometimes they're already writing tests. What they need from their QA partner is someone to help them write better tests, help them understand what to test, help them make their tests better.
Yeah.
If they're not writing any tests and they're not getting any benefits out of it, they may feel very differently about that relationship with QA. If they're collaborating one-to-one and they're writing tests, again, you want the framework to fit the person who's going to be writing the tests or spending most of the time writing the tests. That's what you want to do.
Mm-hmm.
I've had conditions where first BD pilot project I did was with Android, and Android doesn't have a lot of tools that sort of resemble what you get in like a nice JavaScript and Node environment. Right? It's just not mature in that way. And so it was really a matter of, okay, well, what tools do you use? What part of this process can we apply? What things are you willing to write from a testing perspective?
Mm-hmm.
And, is it Android and iOS? On the iOS side, they were very much rejecting everything.
Yeah.
And on the Android side, after some cajoling, embraced everything. And you can see a pretty dramatic difference in the cooperation between the QA that work with each of those teams. Mm-hmm. And you can see a difference in their velocity, you can see a difference in the quality in their output. And it was a factor of their willingness and their understanding of sort of the role that they play.
Yeah, that's great.
Awesome. And then I know too, we have quite a few testers joining us. So what advice if a tester is new to automation, is there any other advice, like can you dig in a little bit deeper on what they can do to kind of get the attractive skill set?
So that's kind of a complex question. One of the hardest things for I think the quality industry and individual people doing QA is that everything's changing really quickly. Technology's changing, tools are changing. What you have to do is changing. I think probably your best bet is think about what's most important to you and what it is you want to do. So if you want to be more technical, you want to work on the server side, you look for things that are much more object-oriented programming, resources that sort of help you with that, and design patterns with that. You focus on best practices for white box testing, right? That's the technical direction you want to go. You want to do automation, look for things that are hard to automate, right? Mm-hmm. Where you can apply creativity to it. There's a whole new world of Internet of Things with companion apps and virtual assistants, AI-driven things. All the old concepts of how you would test, like these are determinate systems, right? So you have to think very, very differently about it. That means you might want to learn more about statistics. That means you might want to learn more about machine learning. That means you might want to learn more about some particular industry and what the users are like, more so than a particular technical skill. I would never say you shouldn't learn code. I would never say you shouldn't play with frameworks. I think everybody should do that. I sort of feel like learning for learning's sake has value. It brings ideas to the table. It gives you new ways of looking at a situation and solving problems in a different way. And I think QA is capable of that as anybody else who does that.
Absolutely.
So it's really just a matter of where you want to focus. I mean, there certainly was a point where if you weren't doing test automation, you couldn't get a role. But there's lots of new stuff that people are building where everything that you might have learned doesn't necessarily apply. Mm-hmm. So you just kind of figure out where you fit, what you're passionate about, and you kind of dive into that. If you're doing end-to-end testing and you want to be that person who built the framework, you're going to need those more technical skills. If you just learn some basic procedural programming and you're in a location where somebody's already built the framework, then you can certainly write those tests if you need to. Again, if you're in a place that's highly collaborative and you're doing something like behavior-driven development, how much coding you have to do might fluctuate pretty wildly, and at what level might fluctuate pretty wildly.
Yeah. So, yeah. There's a lot of, like you touched on, there's a ton of unknowns too. So depending on where people are, right. I mean, there could be unknowns, not just for you, not necessarily knowing on code, but for the organization as a whole. So really being able to be a part of that and just jump in and collaborate too can be very beneficial.
Yeah, I definitely know people with highly technical skills that essentially had a CS degree, decided they liked quality, go into an organization, they're doing automation, and the company drops it, right? Or they drop QA from the process of doing it. right? Those decisions get made all the time, and you're not really sure what situation you're going to be in. It's more important to kind of sort of look at that company's vision, sort of what they're after, what they're going to do. I think when people go to hire, they may have skill sets in mind, but more importantly, they want someone who wants to have the same impact on the world as they do with their product. So that's where you do your research, right? Gain all the skills that you can, anything that you're interested in, and if you just don't feel you want to do that technical piece of coding, look at all the new AI tools coming out. Look at all the codeless solutions. Become an expert at that. Right?
Exactly.
When you sit down and do the interview, that story that you tell makes a very big difference in how you're perceived, because a lot of times people write up a job description with an assumption of what it is that they need.
But maybe that's
not be up to date. It might not. It might be practical, and it might work out. It might not. And they may change what they're doing. They want people who can come in and adapt to that change, whatever that is. So that's something to kind of bear in mind.
Absolutely.
It's a little bit when people say, "Oh, I want to go into testing and what I need to do. How do I catch bugs? All these tools, etc." And something I say very frequently is, your lowest value to the company is your ability to find a bug in the area of the software that's already supposed to be working.
Yeah.
You can always find a machine to do that. You can always find somebody who can do that better than you. Your value is understanding the whole ecosystem and bringing that value as high up into the process as possible. And you can focus on that. Like, that's an expertise that pays dividends off back to the organization in a very, very different way than being the automation engineer at the end, who's like 1 or 2 sprints behind production, churning out test after test after test, and then fixing it when it inevitably breaks. Like, I mean, there's some organizations where that's perfectly fine, and others that's no value. It's kind of a waste of resources.
So. And not fun for that person who's doing it either. So
not fun. I mean, they're getting paid, but where's the challenge? Where's the creativity?
Exactly.
It might be over once the framework is in place, and the rest of it is just busy work.
Yeah. So very interesting.
Great
I like that. Great quotable.
Exactly.
Totally today.
Yeah.
Awesome. I think this is a great opportunity too, just for the testers that are listening to us today. Are there any other, I guess, references, anything that they should be checking out? Any name drops, videos?
Sure. So I would say basically any Udacity, any free resource for procedural programming, just go through those tutorials. Look at something that gives you an example that's fun or interesting to you. That'll help you with the procedural coding. One of my favorite for learning programming is a YouTube channel called Pattern Craft. If you've ever played the game StarCraft, the developer basically models design patterns, which I think tell you a lot about object-oriented programming through these examples in the video game and why the developer creates and uses this pattern. For me, I thought that was actually a really nice way to bring something horribly abstract into something that makes sense. Exactly. Oh, this is why you have a design pattern. This is what, you're solving these types of problems. The developer is doing this because the product guy is going to change his mind halfway through, and now he has to undo all this work. It's the exact circumstance where, either because the product owner has made a decision change or because the developer did the wrong thing. You build up something that's flexible to move around, and that gives you a good basis for that. And that's also, it's kind of fun to watch the guy make little video game objects move around and shoot at each other, and you get to see how things work. So those are 2 different good ones. Also that blog I'll send a link to. That sort of describes
the name that
I can't pronounce. I apologize.
Video editing, maybe flash up.
That actually I think talks about a lot of really good concepts in terms of BD and teams and collaboration. I think that gives you a very different point of view, I think, from your role in the team, whether you're technical or not. And I think that also helps you sort of look for companies that believe in that methodology. It gives you a very different sense of, I can go in here, I can have this level of technical expertise. I'm going to a place where I can contribute, I can add value. And because of this, I can gain my expertise there without fear of not actually being able to do my job.
Exactly.
Those are really, really different environments.
Great insight. Thanks for the recommendations, too.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to throw it to the producer here. I know we talked about having time for questions. How are we looking?
It's on time.
We're good? Okay, cool. Let's see. Let's make sure we covered everything.
What else can I tell you?
Yeah, I'm sure.
Anything you want, just keep going.
Yeah, I'm sure we can keep going. I'm curious to learn a little bit more about your insights with regards to behavior-driven development. How do you decide when to go with that over test-driven development?
So, like I said, they have a different purpose.
Right.
Test-driven development, from my point of view, is very much engineering development decision. Some engineering teams take that approach. Again, it's think of it less. I like to not think of it as, hey, I'm doing testing and that's what I'm doing. This is how I design my code, right? And BDD, this is how I design my feature, right? That's going to work well for some platforms and for some engineering teams and not others. With BDD, I actually think it's a little bit more universal. Essentially, if you look at most organizations, and I've yet to go to one where I didn't see this problem, developers don't always get user stories that they completely understand. Sometimes they're not complete. I think one of the worst cases, developer said to the product owner, hey, I don't know what I'm supposed to build here. This is incomplete. And the response was, yeah, I don't know what it's going to be either, but just get started because I'm afraid to run out of time.
Oh.
Yeah.
That's an easy way to waste time right there.
Right. So,
yeah.
so you have that thing to correct. And then you have that communication channel, right? So you're not efficiently communicating back and forth to what is supposed to be done. And then you have QA at the end testing to see whether or not the spec has been implemented and their test plan may not match the spec.
Mm-hmm.
The product owner may have a chat with the dev. They may change the specification and how it's supposed to work. So now you have a problem with testing, and now you have a problem with whether or not it's working correctly. People forget what's going on. Then they stop documenting what they have, or if they have documented, they don't update it because they crunch for time.
Yeah.
Like most engineering teams I run into have some combination, if not all of those things in common, in terms of what makes it hard to do their jobs. And so when I look at behavior-driven development, it feels like a way to address those things. And if everybody agrees that they have those problems, then you can at least start with the process of changing the way you collaborate to try to address those. Yeah, because it's communication. Right? A lot of people don't think of communication. I think we made that transition from waterfall, where you had a nice defined set of phases through the development cycle. A lot of this ideation, spec writing, review process that took forever that happened up front, made sure that as things moved down the line, everybody knew what they were supposed to do. And it was perfectly fine to chuck things over the wall, right? Because you knew the guy who was catching it had his role and responsibility and everything had gone through all the checks beforehand. With Agile, you squashed all of that, and the dependency is on the collaboration of the team. You're supposed to have different skills, different disciplines. You're supposed to work together to solve the problems together. But as we made that transition, a lot of teams still throw things over the wall. The DevOps guy isn't necessarily on the team. He's in his own group, and you toss things over to him, and it's his responsibility. The QA, not necessarily part of the team, even if they're sitting there, they're tossing things over to them. It's their responsibility. All those really nice things that made that process work in waterfall are gone. And so all the effects of that are now really, really quite prevalent. And it's a lot of work that the person who's sort of catching that ball has to do to compensate for it. Or, the problems don't actually get addressed regardless of what we do. And then that's why companies start making decisions like, okay, well, I won't have DevOps, I'll go no ops. Yeah. I'll just have engineers and they all have to work together. I won't have QA. All the developers do the testing. Right? Because what are you doing? You're taking that was a multidisciplinary group that was supposed to be talking together, and you're just filling it with one discipline because you know that they'll talk together. So some cases that works out very well. I wouldn't use it for anything mission critical.
No, definitely not.
I wouldn't do it for medical software. I wouldn't do it for anything where things might light on fire. I wouldn't do
transactional payment processing. Yeah.
I wouldn't do it. I wouldn't do it anywhere where my market of competition doesn't have a better sense of quality. Right? Quality is a feature. It's what the users expect. If they don't get it and your competitor has it, they're going to go there. Just, even if it doesn't have this richer feature set, that's what they're going to do. With painful user software, and it's that poor quality.
Exactly. It's definitely not confidence inspiring as a user, especially if it is critical.
And particularly web apps. I mean, how long does it take you to install a new one? You actually get mad if you install something, if you go through the trouble of putting it on your phone. The wait, the time, and it's not what it is you want, it's gone in a second.
First impressions are everything.
Yeah. A lot of, and you also have a different user group. Some people are getting lower in phones. They don't want, they want to pop it on full of images. They don't want that heavy app. They want a web view. They want something they can browse to. And if you don't have a good experience on that end, then So just go to somebody else who does, right? And that's just a hard thing to trade off.
Sure.
From a product point of view, from an investment point of view.
Cool. Full of insights. So I guess one question. So let's say you're at an organization who's looking to implement an automated process. You've already decided who's going to write the test and all that, and you're trying to implement it. One big area of cost and problems for a lot of organizations is looking for maybe that CI infrastructure.
Sure. Or
or how to run those tests outside of just the developers, local machines. Do you have any insights or learnings there that you can share?
So a lot of times the development will set up the CI environment, the deployment environment, because it meets their needs. But sometimes you go to an organization where that's not the case. They don't have a CI environment at all. They're not using Jenkins or anything else.
Sure.
Personally, my most experience was with GitLab. GitLab I thought was actually rather nice. Documentation was pretty good. You have a containerized solution, so if you learn about Docker, you pick up a little bit of coding, you can actually set up a pretty nice CI pipeline with testing, various other metrics and reporting that go in separate stages. And it's actually not terribly difficult to make the whole system auto-scale.
Okay.
And so you don't have developers waiting on builds, so you can afford to run all these extra heavy tests, but it can happen at the same time.
Sure.
Yeah, I would say it's worth a team, regardless of what stage they're in development, to make sure to have a nice seamless pipeline where they check the code in, it gets some measure of testing, and it can be deployed at the push of a button.
Yeah.
If you do that, it is so worth it. If you do that right now up front,
It's amazing down the line.
it's amazing down the line. When you have a lot of stuff and it's complicated and you can't deploy your code or your processes don't fit, such that you're running into problems when you're checking to main and you've got a deadline coming up. But that hurts. That's a lot of drag when you're trying to go as fast as possible. Nothing you do is going to prevent that hotfix that you're going to get. Right? You get to the point where that emergency hotfix is now a routine. You just plan for it in the schedule. Hotfix is not supposed to be something you plan, but I've definitely worked on teams where they plan to do a hotfix.
Really?
Every single.
That's not a great plan. But
It's like
expecting the worst.
That is a problem.
Yes.
What you want is to push that button, and it doesn't matter how much code you've written. Whatever goes out is perfectly happy for the user to see. You do that, and you can make all the changes you want. You can iterate as fast as you want. The engineers like it. Certainly, quality likes it, but everybody hates doing a bunch of work and you can't release on time because of some other thing that has nothing to do with you. That's depressing.
Yeah.
So, we have some
So
questions.
yeah, to further talk about the CI/CD cycle,
Sure.
Does the repeated run of even a single test show a value as it gets run every CI/CD cycle? Or can you quantify this to show the value of your tests running against every RC? It's kind of a tricky one.
Interesting. So
Yeah.
does a single repeated test show value? I think it gives confidence. Again, it depends on how you're using your automation. If you're a developer and you're checking, you're doing your pull request, and you get a green light from all the automated tests that run, I think that gives you confidence you haven't missed something important.
Absolutely.
If you have integration level tests that you're running with your unit testing framework, that gives you confidence you've implemented the feature to spec if you're following the process.
Yeah.
You know that you're done. It's like you're coding and it's guide rails, right? You can't go off the road, you can't screw up. You know exactly how far along you've gotten if somebody else has to pick up that work. There's a lot of confidence you get from that.
Yeah. And ideally, if you can keep those run times down of these tests that you're running, that's good too. Because we talked about the end-to-end tests earlier, and those being very time consuming. Yeah. And that is tough if you're, under the gun on a cycle or something, you need to get out of change and you're waiting a long time for these tests to run. So figuring out how to optimize that, I feel like is pretty important as well.
But yeah, so the value of a single test, quantify that value, probably kind of difficult.
Yeah.
If the automation effort was to cover everything and you accomplish that, does every individual test have value? Probably not. Maybe the more critical areas of your application are the ones that are experiencing the most change. Those tests there are going to be inherently more valuable than something that runs over your login page that you haven't changed in the last 5 years.
Yeah.
Right. So again, when you're looking at quantity, does this system, as you said, run fast enough that I get feedback within a timely amount? So if it's doing feature validation and I'm getting that feedback quickly, that's good for the developer. if they can wait on UI validation for like 10 minutes, 20 minutes, an hour,
Yeah.
maybe that's okay. Maybe another organization it's not okay. And those need to be faster, and so maybe you need to either take your system and scale it out so you can cover that faster, or maybe you need to slice and dice and decide exactly what you're going to test.
Yeah.
You want to be strategic. What aren't you going to do that you could do that better fits the situation you're in? You want to plan. What is our optimal value? How do we drive towards it as a group?
Yeah, and you actually kind of already touched on the next question that we had come through, which is how do you fit the slow process of end-to-end automation into CI/CD? So like you said, deciding when to run it and when it makes sense.
Right.
So yeah, like as I've seen before, maybe with every push in a master, you're not necessarily running it, but when you are ready to push a release branch, if you're doing that at a certain time, then you can run those end-to-end tests for that extra level of sanity.
Yeah, it also depends. Again, your organization, if you're a sprint behind with all your automation coverage, how important is it that you run it before you do the release?
That's a great point.
Is it going to check anything you've just written? Right?
Yeah.
If you have a system where you're writing your tests faster, maybe you're using a new AI tool, maybe it's very easy for QA to write your end-to-end tests. Okay, by all means, run that thing as often as possible. That's useful. If I get a report every day that tells me we haven't broken the UI, that's good, right? I'm confident come release time.
Yeah.
But if it costs me a mint because I have to scale, and EC2 instances to get my coverage, I might feel differently about that cost.
Sure.
Right? It really kind of depends. So you're always making trade-offs, and it's always about sort of having that collaborative decision as to what's going to work best, and then changing it when it's not working. That's the other thing. People have a tendency to invest heavily in something they think is going to work, and then when it's not, they have to kind of continue on that line.
Yeah, because you already bought in. You already
bought in. You have that sunk cost fallacy. It's just you double down because you don't want to sort of give it up. Wherever possible, try to make every aspect of your system as modular as you can. If somebody comes out with something that's in the middle of your CI system that works a little bit better than it did before, ideally you should be able to just swap it to that because that's going to be what's right for you.
Yeah.
If you think about everything, approach everything, including in our processes that way, then you actually become an agile team. Right? Then you actually are able to adapt to the market, adapt to the changing conditions. You can adapt to the fact that you may have new people on the team with new skill sets or people who leave and do other things. You can adapt to both, but you have to have that notion that you're going to optimize for change in the way you approach everything, and you're going to remove drag in the way that you approach everything.
Yeah.
You do those two things, you'll figure it out.
And you're really good at actually leading into these questions we're getting. Like, what sacrifices do you give up with putting end-to-end testing into CI/CD pipelines? So can't touch on that indirectly, but maybe if you could.
What are the resources are going to require to get your end-to-end tests in place? Are you going to have a development team writing those tests? Probably not. If you do, that's a different set of choices you make. Are you using a tool that makes it easier to write those tests, which means your manual QA can do that? Are you using a tool that self-maintains, which means your maintenance cost goes down? If you're not doing either one of those things, what sort of expertise do you need on the team to do that? Are you okay with being behind? Does it have to be real time? These are all variables that every organization should be making those decisions on purposefully, but not making the assumption that what they know how to do is necessarily the best thing they should do.
Yeah, you have to really decide what your priorities are and then go from there, whether it's speed, overall coverage, cost, etc.
Yeah, your release cycle might be every 2 weeks. It might be every week. It might be every day.
Yeah.
What you do will make a big difference depending on that decision, for example. Right?
Yeah. All right, so next we have one of the toughest general questions that ever comes up. How do you balance a dev's need to release code quickly with ensuring proper QA standards within an organization?
Yeah, not to beat a dead horse there, but again, the thing I personally think works best is just BD, right? So if you start with good specifications and you know what you're building, that's gonna make things easier for the developer. They can just code. That's what they like to do. Is they're good at. They can just code and get that out the door. That's going to make a big difference. So also the notion of releasing, right? So again, that's a broader discussion. But do you release at the end of the sprint? Is the release tied to your sprint cadence? It doesn't have to be.
Exactly.
That can make a big difference as well. If your CI/CD system can release one feature at a time as easily as it can 50, it's a big difference, right? Now you don't have to squeeze yourself in because you have a release date. Things can roll out. There's lots of really good engineering practices for high-performing teams where they make heavy use of feature flagging, right? So one of the things that I'd like to do where I am now is improve the way that we get tickets ready for development to work on, make sure by the time development gets it, it's 100% something they can implement. That makes a huge difference.
Yep.
If the pipeline is clean, if you have a good way of doing testing, a good way of deploying, that need to release things quickly, you can go as fast as you possibly can go. The rest of the system will take care of you. Maybe it makes sense, maybe there's 3 parts to a feature. Maybe you can do one part now and users don't see it, another part later when it's optimal to do it, right? When resources are available or whatever balance that the business makes and product makes. And then you don't need it to go at a particular time. Maybe it's 2 or 3 sprints later that last piece gets turned on.
Yeah.
Maybe you release that first piece now, users can see it, but it's not the full thing that you're going to do. You can release it every couple of sprints, right? You have a lot of options. I think the problem is people sort of narrowly perceive of a sprint as something that everything has to be done.
Definitely. It's more of just a way of planning and kind of
it's a way of planning. It doesn't have to have anything to do with your release cycle or release cadence.
Correct.
You can actually have a very, very fast release cadence depending on what you're pushing out. It's different with mobile. People think you can't do continuous delivery with mobile. You can't send it to your users. No, you have a process with Apple you have to go through, but you can release things to beta internal users. You can have the same cadence you might have if you're a fully web team, and you can get feedback from people who can let you know you're doing the right thing.
Yeah.
And again, it's still a push button process. Like it maybe stops because there has to be a review with Apple, but your development can keep going on. You know it's provisioned and you have good communication on your team. Those things don't have to change because you have to wait for Apple's approval.
Sure. Yeah, that's a great summary.
Okay, cool. So it looks like we went a minute over. Apologies.
Okay. I was going to say anything after your question, but that's
Run. Yeah, so this concludes the webinar. As promised, we will be conducting a raffle. It's going to be offline. We'll be giving out Testlio swag. So you can see we've also got some stuffed lions and I think maybe a shirt or 2. But yeah, we'll be passing out exclusive swag. We'll notify you if you win the raffle. We're going to be giving out 1 ticket to every person that is signed up live, that is actually attended the webinar, as well as a ticket for every question that you asked. So thanks so much. I'm Mike.
Jared.
Ken. All right. And thanks for joining us today. How'd that go? You may be still online.
Yeah.
Oops.
And